Welcome, everyone. It is Dr. Linder, and we're going to be learning about anatomy and physiology. So, when we talk about anatomy and physiology, why don't we discuss what these two things are? So, when we talk about anatomy, we're talking about structure of the human body. When we talk about physiology, we're talking about function. There's a basic principle that you may have heard, and it's structure determines function. Structure determines function. The way something is structured helps to determine how it's going to function. So if we look at, let's say, the shoulder joint, the way your shoulder can move around, it's a ball and socket joint. Because it's a ball and socket, it can move in a wide variety of ranges of motion. But if you look at, let's say, the elbow joint in relationship, the elbow just flexes and extends. It opens and closes like a hinge of a door. So structure determines function. And we can study structure in a variety of ways. We could look at structure by doing dissection. We could look at structure by looking at x-rays. We could look at structure by doing cadaver studies, by doing MRIs, CAT scans. Physiology is how things function. So if I want to assess the structure of someone's neck and cervical spine, I can say, rotate your head to the left, rotate your head to the right, bring your chin to your chest, look all the way up to the ceiling. Now I'm looking at function. If the function is off or the function is restricted, I can assume that something is wrong with the structure. So these two go hand in hand. When we look at anatomy, we can also look at microscopic anatomy. Microscopic anatomy are things that you cannot see with the naked eye. So we need a microscope to examine them. Maybe we want to examine cells. Maybe we're looking at molecules. These are all microscopic. When we're looking at cells specifically, there's a term that we use called cytology. CYT. Whenever you see that, CYT, we are referring to the cell, the type of cell. As we move along, we may study something called an osteocyte. Well, osteo is bone. Cyte is cell. So now we're talking about a bone cell. We may be talking about a chondrocyte. Chondro means cartilage. Now we're talking about a cartilage cell. We may be talking about a hepatocyte. Hepato, like hepatitis, means liver. Now we're talking about a liver cell. So whenever you see cyte, we're going to link that to cell. Now, when cells come together and they join, they can link up and they're going to make tissues. When we study tissues, we're going to refer to that as histology. Now, in another week, I will be talking about tissues, and there are 4 types of tissues. There's epithelial tissue, there's connective tissue, there is muscle tissue, and there's nerve tissue. So we have 4 types of tissues that we're going to be talking about in another week: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nerve tissue. But first, we have to learn about the cell. And this week, we're going to be talking a lot about the cell. When cells come together, they make tissues. When we study tissues, we call it histology. The person who studies tissues is called a histologist. Women know this. Women know this very well because when they go to the gynecologist once a year, they go for a pap smear. Pap is named Pap after the physician who was Greek, and his name was George Papanicolaou. So they took Pap from Papanicolaou. So a Pap smear is when they slough off some of the tissues, cells and tissues of the tip of the uterus. And it goes to a histologist, they'll study it, and they will determine if the cells and tissues are precancerous or cancerous. So you've heard of the term dysplasia, cervical dysplasia, which just means that they're abnormal size and shape. So now what you heard me just say was that when cells come together, they make tissues. Well, what is it that makes up cells? Let's go a step before. Let's look at number one. We have chemicals. Chemicals come together to make up cells, and then cells come together to make up tissues. Well, what do we mean by chemistry? Well, since we're studying anatomy and physiology, when I think of chemistry, I also think of a term called biochemistry. And when I think of biochemistry, I think of our foods that we eat, our nutrition. And our nutrition is made up of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, right? Carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And when we look at carbohydrates, they're made up of lots of carbons and oxygen and hydrogen, and so are proteins. But maybe the carbons and the oxygens and the hydrogens are arranged in a different particular structure. And because they're structured different, they function different. And then fats also are made up of carbohydrates and of carbons and hydrogens and oxygens, and maybe we have nitrogens in there, or maybe we have some phosphorus. So we have a bunch of these things that could be organized in a different fashion. These are called atoms: carbons, hydrogens, oxygens, nitrogens, phosphates, or phosphorus. And when these things come together, they make up structure. Look at that. That's a double helix, and that is a structure. So that's DNA. That's a molecule of DNA, deoxyribose nucleic acid. All that is a bunch of chemicals organized, held together by certain types of bonds, and then these chemicals come together to make cells. And cells are made up of, when we learn about them, we'll learn about a nucleus and a cell wall that's a bilayer. It's got two layers to the cell wall. They call it a phospholipid bilayer. But this phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane is made up of carbohydrates and proteins and fats. And that's why good balanced nutrition is so very important, so that we can make healthy cells. And if we have healthy cells, we can have healthy tissues. And then tissues come together to make up organs. In this case, we have the stomach. And we could see that this organ is made up of epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue. We have different tissues that make it up. Now, we can have a bunch of organs like the stomach and the liver and the intestines, and a lot of these organs work in harmony together to digest our food. And since they're functioning in harmony together in alignment, that makes up a system. And we have a lot of systems in the body. This one in particular is the digestive system. But we have the immune system, the respiratory system, reproductive system, endocrine system, musculoskeletal system, cardiovascular system, integumentary system, the renal system. We have 11 different systems that we'll talk about in another video. When all those systems come together, they make up the crowning creation of all, called the organism. So chemicals come together to make cells, cells come together to make tissues, tissues make organs, organs make systems, and the systems come together to make the human being or the organism. Okay, good place to take our first break. And when I come back, we'll talk about some of the systems.